welcome to the Integration Station. I'm Michael, a child and adolescent occupational therapist, and with me today
is Eleanor. I'm also a child and adolescent occupational therapist and clinical director at OTFC Group.
And she is my boss as well. So welcome, Eleanor. Thank you for coming back.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. The feedback was glowing, positive, and I couldn't say no for having you back on the podcast. So
That is too kind. Any opportunity to check in with you, I am happy.
I have to thank your mum for the feedback as well. She did provide a lot of that, so that was great.
I asked her to reach out actually, so I'm glad she took me up on that.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, parents. Each episode we'll be discussing how we can best support young people in our lives and certainly find the fun in learning these things. We'll take your questions, throw in some of our own, and hopefully find some insight through our discussions. Those who have listened previously, we'll answer the questions via multiple platforms. I think we've got the OTFC group at Instagram. Otherwise, the old-fashioned email, podcast at otfcgroup.au. I'll get it right. And today, our conversations are about a few questions. We've got 3 questions. One about handwriting. So for all those OTs out there, particularly new grads, you might get a few referrals. We've got a new OT asked a question about that. Supporting a child with sensory needs that are different to your own. So a bit of co-regulation. And a question about drop-off at the start of the day for kids going to childcare or early learning. So a bit of variety there, but certainly some conversation that hopefully will provide some insight. First one came from this person who asked about handwriting. So thoughts on handwriting. I just started as an OT and the number of referrals for these is a lot. So that's a very fair question. And I remember when I first started as an OT, I think there were a lot of people that came to us to work on handwriting.
Yeah, definitely.
So I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think we do have lots of families or educators referring young people for support with handwriting. And I completely appreciate that it is, a really key part in lots of school expectations and to support in showing that learning and building those skills. But I know for so many of the young people that we have come through here, that's actually a really just a tricky task. It can actually be a barrier to their learning and their engagement. And so I find myself often, and I think this will be my phrase that I repeat as through these discussions, is I guess understanding what that young person's needs are and where they're at, and then either going, well, is there opportunities for us to facilitate that skill development to make that more positive for them, make it a little bit easier, less effortful, or is it that we're actually looking for alternate means for them to express their work and their understanding in a way that meets their learning differences?
So if we strip it back, I think, for handwriting, if we go right back, so for those who may be familiar, they may not be aware, but for those out there, if you did a quick Google, you could look up a pyramid of development or a central nervous pyramid. And essentially what that provides you is an understanding of what we spend a lot of time working on here is understanding the sensory foundations for more complex skills. And something like handwriting is an extremely complex task, right at the top of that pyramid, almost the apex predator of of skills, if you will, and a really tricky one to master. But if we're breaking that down to those sensory foundations, then there's a lot in there that is required before we can get up to handwriting.
Yeah,
correct?
For sure. And I guess when we're referring to those foundations, what we're really meaning, if I was to list off just a few of those key skills that we need to then have success at that top level, we need to have the visual processing skills to support us in that task, and then how we integrate those skills that then supports our movements for the motor component. Then you're bringing in, am I able to, receive and understand touch input on my hand so that I'm holding my pencil in the correct spot? And am I applying the right amount of force that I need to draw on the page? Let alone bringing in things like your postural control and your balance to stabilize in a chair. Being able to use both sides of your body as well, where you've got one hand stabilizing and one hand writing. You can see there's so many things going on all at once, and bringing that together. And can we actually plan and put all of those skills together to then be able to engage in handwriting. And what I guess we see quite often in some of the assessments and things that we undergo is we're trying to understand, well, what is it at that foundational level that's maybe making that tricky in a classroom or in other writing tasks, and how can we support that? And interestingly, with our practice, there are lots of services where that's skill development is supported, sitting at the table, lots of practice, but we're actually, with the model that we use in air sensory integration, we're exploring that foundational skill development in really fun and play-based activities where we rarely sit at the table, if at all, and still look to support those same outcomes.
So for a young OT or a starting OT, this young person, getting a lot of referrals for handwriting, I guess you're thinking, instead of going, let's sit down and handwrite, you're trying to encourage them to look more at, well, can we discuss with that young person, the family, the importance of these other skills and maybe look more at where their fine motor skills are generally.
Yeah.
And looking at, you talked about visual perception.
Yeah.
You talked about force and pressure, and how are those other skills in other daily areas, so we can then build a bit of a profile of, it might be tricky for handwriting, but it might also be tricky in lots of other ways.
Yeah, for sure.
In lots of other skills.
Yeah.
So,
like a dressing task card with fine motor components like buttons and zips. Is it like coordinating cutlery is really challenging? It's those same foundational skills applied in other settings, because ultimately these things support us in everything that we do in our day. I completely agree. Trying to understand, well, do these things align with other activities of daily living or other occupations?
Yeah. And so we have someone that comes in and says, I want to work on handwriting. And so this young OT, or even ourselves as OTs have been for a little while, we would certainly argue, as you said, using the air sensory integration model, would argue that there's a lot more to handwriting than meets the eye, if you will, to throw in a bit of a bad phrase. But essentially that's what it is. Part of it is visual, part of it is written, part of it is sitting.
Yeah.
So if I'm focusing on handwriting and I'm talking about it to parents, I'm saying handwriting is an extremely complicated task. And what we want to make sure is this person has all those foundations that are developed. If they have motivation to write, and that's something they want to do, then okay, well, let's build in some of their interests in that. How do we make handwriting more enjoyable? Because the last thing you want to do is to focus so much on handwriting that then it becomes something that I don't want to do.
Yeah.
And then you completely lose that opportunity.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And I think we haven't even spoken about, as part of this, that's just some of those sensory motor foundational skills, let alone bringing in all those other components of our regulation, our attention,
Sure.
Just those mental processing skills and how we link those in as well.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, and I think it's just trying to understand if handwriting is a goal, where are those key elements that we can support in to ultimately promote engagement in that task.
And I think the other thing, which you kind of alluded to before, was if handwriting is so hard for this person, then are there other accommodations or other changes? And I know one thing, and it's, maybe mentioned here, why OTs always get handwriting referrals, and why do we always get these questions about handwriting? And I think, I don't know whether it's just a historical thing, but there's this understanding that OTs deal mainly with the upper limb.
Yeah.
And there's this, I don't know, that's come from maybe a medical model, but that OTs focus on upper limb things. And yes, we have hand therapists, and yes, we have a lot of OTs that work predominantly in that space, but also there's a variety that work in a number of spaces. And as child and adolescent OTs, we're looking at a much bigger picture than just, can I write? I think from my perspective, handwriting is such a big skill, and there are so many components to it that to focus on just can this child write yes or no is losing sight of every other facet of the sensory systems that are required for that skill. Yeah. So.
And I think, it's okay to focus at times too on maybe it's a little bit more functional outcomes. They might not be the neatest writer in the world, but they're able to communicate some basic things in that format. And we see some really incredible young people come through that have so much to offer and communicate, but in terms of what their preferences and where they're learning, where their best learning looks, it can be away from handwriting. And so if it's going to present that barrier, why not look at other things? Because otherwise it could be them just disengaging completely. So for the person that wrote in and asked, they're getting quite a few referrals come through for handwriting. If you have the opportunity to access assessments or tools that help break down some of those foundations, because this is going to be the hardest thing. If you start working on handwriting without maybe addressing some of those key factors underneath, you're not going to see the outcomes that, you're looking to work towards. Quite possibly. It might be that with practice and repetition, you're able to build some skills in that way, but can we unpack that a little bit further so that you can actually target the things that young person needs to support them in this task?
And some of those assessments may be...
Even I did a handwriting assessment actually for a young person yesterday. We have access to the evaluation and air sensory integration as ASI accredited therapists. But I also did that in combination with the full set of the BERI for anyone who's listening that knows that there's some opportunities to look at visual motor integration, visual processing and motor coordination as part of that. And I think that can be a pretty cool way to have a look at that. And this gorgeous young person that I was working with, she worked so hard to undertake this task, and I'm going, you just shouldn't have to work that hard. And I could hear she was voicing at times hesitancy around it, or that she wasn't as good. She actually said to me, I'm not as good at drawing and other things as other people in my class. And I'm thinking, that must be so hard to think and feel that every day. So actually, yes, I can support that skill development to hopefully build up her confidence in these activities, but are there potentially other ways that she can be communicating the same thing?
Yeah, very true.
Yeah.
Are you okay to go to the next question?
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah. So the next one is, how do I support my child when my sensory needs are opposite to theirs? So what I'm reading from this question is, if I need to support my child, or maybe to co-regulate with my child, but what their sensory needs are different to mine, how do we find a common ground?
Yeah. And Michael, I know that you work with quite a few parents of like young people that are also accessing the practice that maybe have some differences in their sensory preferences and how to work through that, plus just your own experience as a parent. Is that something that, these are common things that you're working through yourself or with some of the families that you work with?
Yeah, I think so. I think a lot of the time our sensory preferences are our sensory preferences, and they are hard to change. And so what you get is, say, a child who, I can use my son as an example, of course, who likes to be very busy and very active. And so I also try and be busy and active with him, but there are times when he doesn't like too much noise going on in the space, whereas I like music, and I'll have something cooking, or I'll have the TV going, and I know that frustrates him and he doesn't like that, and that can dysregulate him. So the difference is I'm trying to be more aware of those sensory preferences. And I think the biggest learning tool when we are trying to work on differences in sensory preferences is, do I understand that person's sensory preference?
Yeah.
And for a child, they're not going to fully understand your preferences very well. That's quite a higher order skill, but they might be able to see how you are when you do get the right sensory input.
Yeah.
And they're also able to see, when I'm getting the right sensory input, how I respond.
Yeah.
So what I always start with is almost a checklist, if you will, or say like breaking down what that person's sensory preferences are, and then knowing yourself what your sensory preferences are, and developing two separate sensory toolkits.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that you have a toolkit that works for you, and then that young person has a sensory toolkit, which for young people we often refer to as things like sensory diets or, sensory tools. And you're able to implement those when you need them, But in terms of doing it together, trying to find where are the commonalities, where's that common ground to go. I actually like the smell of that. I like the smell of that, or I like that music. I also like that music. So when we are together, we need to make sure that we are having those things more consistently to ensure that we are quite regulated.
Yeah.
Because as an adult, the challenge is if you're dysregulated, and I know we touched about this in, I think it was on the socials as well, about co-regulation and managing tantrums and those sort of things. If you're dysregulated as an adult, the chance of that child being regulated is next to none. So a dysregulated adult with a dysregulated child is a really tough time for everybody. But a dysregulated child with a regulated adult, which is, very common, gives you a little bit more chance to work through some things. Supporting a child when their sensory needs are so different to yours takes time, takes patience, and it takes a lot of, I also need some time just to step away for a second.
Yeah.
And it even comes back to, they talk about when children are very, very young, when they're babies and they're crying a lot and you're frustrated, and they tell you, put the child in the cot and put them down so there's no risk of something else happening, to make sure it's clear that in this moment you are not regulated and you don't want anything bad to happen. They'll be okay there. You need to take time for yourself to regulate yourself. And I think a similar principle applies here. If you need that moment, or you know that something works for you that can get you back on even just taking that notch down a little bit to be more regulated, having a sensory toolkit that allows you to do that is only going to help. And it's going to teach that child that, hey, mum or dad or my caregiver knows what to do and uses these strategies to help them regulate.
Yeah,
and that's teaching that young person self-regulation skills through that co-regulation.
I think I really liked a lot of the things that you'd mentioned there around that modelling of your authentic needs. So if there's something that you're feeling like you need in that moment, that you're articulating that, because then you're showing that it's okay to honour your preferences and needs to then hopefully support that with your young person as well. I actually find myself in the space a lot. I'll just, as I'm moving and doing different activities, I might label how I'm feeling with different sensory input. Some kids come through and they love to spin on the swings and things like that. And I'll say to them, my body actually doesn't respond very well to that. And I find that really hard. But I can see for you, you really thrive off that opportunity. And actually, it helps you come into this just right space where you're able to, problem solve with me and plan through different things. And that's awesome. And isn't it interesting how your body responds so differently to the same input that mine does? And having those conversations, I think, and drawing awareness to that when we're both in a space to do so, going back to your point, when we've got a dysregulated young person, trying to model that's not the time to do that, but perhaps if we've been able to work through that, it could look a little bit different. And it must be so hard, I imagine, as a parent when, maybe when you're not feeling so regulated yourself and that deep pressure through the hug and comfort of someone is really supportive as an example. And then when you see your young person having a really hard time, you go to implement those same strategies that work for you. But actually for them, they just need to know that you're there. And that's all you have to say to them. But coming into their space actually doesn't meet their needs in that moment, even though for yourself that works really well. But like you said, I think that's just owning that toolbox and what that looks like for each person, just practicing that over time, right?
Yeah, I think the other thing is that as a putting my parent hat on, when you find you're in a situation where you can't manage that or you're finding it really hard, there is this parent guilt, like I can't support my child in this moment.
Yeah.
And I know they need this, but I don't like that. And that's a really hard situation to be in. Like and I do talk about that with certain, parents that I work with, that it is okay to feel that, but the fact that you're understanding and taking time to appreciate that difference and being able to work through that and discuss that with someone, or even coming to see an OT to work through these sort of strategies is an indication that you you are being the best, trying to be the best version of yourself and trying to be the best parent you can be.
Yeah.
By working through that and really appreciating that child's needs and understanding where your needs are. And it just comes back to finding that balance.
Yeah.
As soon as the ledger tips one way or the other, it does get extremely hard. And I can understand as a parent, you're doing a lot for your child or children a lot of the time. But we always talk about, putting on your own life support first.
Yeah, yeah.
And I know it's maybe a throwaway line, but it's true. It's really important that when it comes to whether it's regulation or whether it's just self-care, to make sure that you have tools in your kit that help keep you regulated. So when your sensory needs, for example, are different to a child's sensory needs, that you're able to go, that's okay, I can manage this for now because after I'll do this. Or before we go into this situation, I know I need to smash this music through my AirPods for 20 minutes, knowing that I'm really not going to enjoy going to this party with a whole bunch of kids that, and other parents that I don't get on that well with.
Yeah.
But my child loves it. I've had this and afterwards I can have that.
Yeah. And do you know what I actually think is really cool about this question? I think it's pretty amazing that this person's able to be able to recognize in themselves, hey, I'm watching what my young person needs and I'm thinking about and reflecting on what my own needs are, and I can see that there's a difference here and how can I best support that? I think that awareness is amazing.
Okay, we got one more question for this episode. It's about drop off with kids. So when I drop off my kids at daycare, they throw a big tantrum and won't go in.
Have you had this experience at all?
Not so much with, I'm going to lie. I don't do a lot of the drop offs, just my wife does most of the drop offs.
Yeah.
So the times that I take my son in, he's usually pretty excited. Like, Dad's taking me in, and it's not a problem. But it's more of when we get into the spaces where sometimes that happens.
Yeah.
And it's less tantrum and more big, Dad don't go.
Gotcha.
Or like the mum don't go, that feeling of separation and that anxiety that comes from being separated from that caregiver in that moment. But when dropping off kids at daycare or childcare centre or something like that, throwing a big tantrum, I think you talked about it in one of the previous episodes, is anytime we see behaviours, we label the term, behaviour.
Yeah.
But behaviour
is something we're observing?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Correct. So something that we're observing is a way for that child to communicate something that's going on for them.
Yeah.
What might be some of the reasons why this person's experiencing this, I guess?
Yeah. I know those mornings before a drop-off could look so different for so many different families, especially if you've got, yourself, maybe you're trying to organise before work or what you need to do. You might have other little people in the house who have got their own needs. You're juggling a million things all at once before trying to fly out the door. And, maybe your mornings feel quite structured and routine driven, or perhaps on the other side of that, they might just feel very chaotic. And whatever that looks like, that's okay. But just, I guess when it comes around to that drop off, is there some things that we can maybe shift or offer some options around, so that maybe when we're entering into the car, we're already starting to think about the regulation opportunities, I guess, from the beginning, which is what I'm trying to say, sorry. So is it that, is it the separation from mum or dad or the caregiver when they arrive? Like, are there some opportunities for some quiet time, one-on-one or with the family before they go? So they've got the opportunity to connect and ground before we're in the car. Maybe we've got some calming music playing, or we've got something to occupy our hands, like therapy or something like that gives a bit of sensory input. I always love, backpack or something weighted on the lap to give that kind of grounding, deep pressure input. So we're already thinking about that in the drive over and making that a space that we can regulate and organise before it comes around to that. And I think validating for that young person to go, I think it's really easy to go, it's okay. But that young person's really trying to say in that moment, regardless of what the reason is, that it's not okay. And to go, I know it's hard to say goodbye, to go into to childcare. Like,
I thought you were going to say go to jail there. It almost sounded like jail. No indication.
That's hard too, isn't it?
No indication in the school system, but anyway, continue.
a slip perhaps, but to go into no, never to go into childcare, and that must feel really hard. But you know what? When I come and pick you up, you can tell me all about your day, and we'll go to the playground before we go home, and let's connect again then.
And what you've done there is also provided some predictability. You've given a bit of a structure, and it could also be when you get in there, such and such caregiver is going to be there, and they will have this activity set up, or this friend that you like playing with will be there as well.
Yeah.
And it's giving some structure, it's giving some predictability, because those behaviours, for whatever reason they're happening, they could come from anxiety. They could come from, I'm not regulated. They could come from this place I don't feel that safe with, but there are some people I do feel safe with, and just reinforcing there are safe people here.
Yeah, and those positive relationships. And I think you're right, Michael, that coming into that space and, perhaps it is the separation from whoever that caregiver might be to come into an environment where we don't know what to expect. We don't know who's going to be there that day. We don't know who those educators or support staff might be, what activities we're going to do. So can we give them one structured thing? I know when I go to childcare, I say goodbye to my family and I meet with this person and we do this activity as an example, just to give even more predictability around that if that's what they're needing. But I love that reinforcement of, well, these are things that you often tell me that you love. And wouldn't that be really cool if you could do that today? And when I come pick you up, you tell me all about it in the car.
Okay. I think there's a few options in there to consider.
Yeah.
Probably raises a bigger question around things to do with school and transitions in general, and maybe possibly another podcast conversation topic.
Yeah, I think that sounds really good. And I know for lots of my families, the clients that I see consistently are that kind of 9 to 12 age range for a bit of context. And so lots of my friends are looking to start like high school next year. And I'm finding myself having conversations with families around transition visits and how they can best support them, anything I can do to facilitate that in anticipation of starting high school next year. So perhaps we can do a bit of a school-focused chat next time we catch up.
Yeah, sure. Well, as per I think it was our first episode, we talked about occupations, and occupations for kids are school. A lot of them spend a lot of time there, so it's pretty important to try and make that as effective a space and safe and regulating space as possible. So maybe we can cover some of that stuff.
Yeah, sounds good.
Next time. Well, I think that's probably a good place to leave that, and got some ideas for next time. But if you do like what you're hearing, I have a pre-prepared speech here. If you like what you're hearing, then you can share this podcast with your friends, colleagues or classmates at uni, or share on socials. That sounds very staged, sorry. But legitimately, if you are able to...
You were reading off of something there?
Yeah, I was.
Wow. I never would have known.
Product placement. No, if you do like what you're listening to, if you don't, that's also fine. But if you do like what you're listening to, share it with friends, family, whoever. By doing that, you're helping everyone to learn a bit more about OT, about sensory integration, about how us as therapists, parents, and whoever can support the young people that we're working with. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And one more thing before we finish off.
Little shout out to Fletch. Hope you're having a good night. We'll see you very soon.
All right. Well, we'll see you next time on the Integration Station. Thanks, Eleanor.
Thanks, Michael.